Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and LP World. Hey, vinyl community and CD community. Do you still like CDs? I do. Anyway, today we're going to go over the discography of Queensryche. I'm going to do worst to best studio albums today. Not going to include any live albums or compilations. And I just want to preface this by saying I'm not going to include any of the newer Todd Latour albums. I think that they're good albums, but after he joined the band, I think they became more of a generic metal band. Not that that's a bad thing, but they sort of have gotten rid of their progressive element at this point. And number two, I don't own them. I've heard them all, and I think they're pretty good. Like I said, they're good metal albums, but I just don't think they're, um, at this point, it's just Michael Wilton and Eddie Jackson. Even Scott Rockenfeld has left the band. So we have two original members. And I just don't think they have that Queensryche sound. But they are good albums if you want to check them out. And also, I do not own their album I'm going to rate the lowest, which is Dedicated to Chaos. This was the last album with Jeff Tate. And really, this album is almost a mellow, non-prog metal influence album at all. The songs aren't very memorable. I didn't even buy it because I listened to it a few times, and I listened to it recently again, and nothing caught my ear. And at this point, I think both the fans and the band were happy to get rid of Jeff Tate at this point. The albums they were making weren't making the fans happy, and the band was at odds. They even had an incident where they were playing a show at a festival, and he was spitting on some of the other band members, and apparently attacked them with a knife afterwards. But at that point, it was a good thing that they sort of split up. Next up was their album American Soldier. Bought this album when it came out. I remember listening to this. I drove down to Atlantic City for a friend's bachelor party. Listened to this a couple times. Again, not very memorable songs. A lot of the songs have sort of recorded testimony from soldiers. I understand it's sort of a concept record or a tribute to soldiers, but the songs just weren't very good. No memorable hooks. Nothing really that caught on. I think "If I Were King" was the only song that sort of had a few spins on airplay. But yeah, it's not a very memorable album. Good attempt, I guess. But it's my lowest album that I own. Next up is the sequel to Operation Mindcrime called Operation Mindcrime 2. Again, this storyline wise, it's pretty good, but at the same time, not too many memorable songs. There are some good songs on here. I'm American, Hostage, The Hands, All the Promises. I forgot the song. I think The Chase is the one with Ronnie James Dio. He sings on there. That's pretty good too. All in all, it's a good companion, I guess, to Operation Mindcrime, but there's no memorable hooks. A lot of the songs on Operation Mindcrime could have been singles on their own outside of the concept of the whole album. This one just doesn't do it for me overall. Besides that, there's just too many songs on here. It's 17 songs. They do go back to, I believe, the original equipment they used on the first one, so the production does have that metallic sound to it. And like I said, "I'm American" is a great song, kind of classic Queensryche there, which they released at first, and everyone was hoping that this was going to be such a great album. But without Chris DeGarmo, I guess they couldn't really pull it off in that sense. And also, the odd thing about this album is when they toured for this album, they played both Operation Mindcrime 1 and 2 in their entirety. But since this is the second part of it, they played Operation Mindcrime one first and then this. So it must have been, I didn't see them on this tour, but it must have been just a chore to see them live to get through this album after hearing the first one. And that's the more memorable one. I do have the DVD of it, that concert that they put out, and it's okay. The stage production and everything is pretty cool. They do play a few older songs in the encore too, so I guess if you sat through this, you got to hear a few older songs. But overall, this was a disappointment, and I understand why they did it at that point. They needed to do something to reignite the band, I think. Moving on is, I wasn't sure if I should include this or not, but it is a studio album, I guess, but it's their cover album called Take Cover. A lot of people don't like this at all, but I think they did some pretty good covers on here. For the Love of Money, Innuendo, Neon Night, Synchronicity, Red Rain, Bullet the Blue Sky, which is a live track. But overall, they did a pretty good job on these songs. They did a few Crosby, Stills, and Nash songs, Almost Cut My Hair and For What It's Worth. And I can't stand Crosby, Stills, and Nash, so the fact that they made them listenable was pretty good. Innuendo is a pretty good cover. You know, most people cover a classic Queen song, but the fact that they did something from their last album was pretty surprising. But overall, the performances on here are pretty good. And I actually saw them on this tour, and they were really good. Played a lot of stuff from Rage for Order on that tour as well. So, definitely recommend this. Next up is the last album with Chris DeGarmo called Here in the Now Frontier. I would say about half of this album is what was considered classic Queensryche. Sign of the Times, Saved, You, Reach. Those are probably in the classic Queensryche vein. The rest of it is more straight ahead, AOR rock. Not sure at what point Chris DeGarmo got disenchanted with being in the band. I don't know if it's a result of this album or just didn't want to tour anymore. But in light of that, you know, fans would kill to hear a Queensryche album like this nowadays. You know, at the time, everybody was really disappointed in this, but in essence, this is the last album that has any sense of Queensryche at all, you know, as far as their classic sound. So I think over time, this album has gotten much better to myself. But, you know, again, it's lower echelon Queensryche. But if you see it, it's definitely worth picking up. Next up is their first album without Chris DeGarmo, Q2K. And I say overall, I pretty enjoyed this album. It doesn't, obviously at this point, there's no any resemblance of Prague or classic Queensryche on here, but there is a lot of good songs on here. Falling Down, Sacred Ground, Breakdown, and the last song, Right Side of My Mind. I'll take back that last statement. The Right Side of My Mind, I think, has some of that classic Queensryche element. It reminds me of Anyone Else, or Is There Anybody Listening from Empire. So this album had Kelly Gray on guitar. I think he's the only one he played on. He was also the producer at that point. And he's not a very... He's limited as far as his guitar skills goes. I think that some of the later guys they got, including the guy they have now, Parker, I can't think of his last name, he's much better guitar player and much better at covering Chris DeGarmo's parts. Kelly Gray, at that point, not so great at covering Chris DeGarmo. But overall, I think this is an enjoyable album. Again, this is an album I think a lot of people were disappointed with at the time, but over time, to me, this album has aged pretty well. Like I said, it's got really good songs on it. So check that out. Next up is Promised Land. Now, this album came out in 1994. So this was the first Queensryche album post-grunge explosion. And it's definitely a mellower album. has some progressive elements into it, but this is the album where sort of like the metal was just sucked out of them. I Damaged. Beyond that, there's not too much hard rock on here. A lot of slow, introspective songs. Some of the songs are more challenging to listen to. Bridge was a pretty good ballad, actually got some airplay. One More Time Around is a pretty good song. Reminds me of another song that reminds me of Is There Anybody Listening? The album ends with Someone Else, a piano ballad, just piano and vocal. On one of their CD singles, they actually have the full band version of it, which I think is much better. They should have put that on here and then the piano only on the CD single. At this point, this album actually went platinum. So Queensryche was one of the few metal bands from the 80s actually had a platinum album in the 90s. They were still a pretty big touring act on here. And if you saw this tour, they had a big stage show with all these actors and a lot of stuff going on. And this was the first tour also that they started to bring back some of the older classic songs. I think they played NM 156 on this tour from The Warning. So again, overall, good album. Not my favorite album by a long shot, but considering the time it was released, it was a pretty good effort. And I is one of their all-time classics. So now we're entering the top 5, which are, I guess, considered the classic Queensryche albums. My number 5, I think people might be surprised I rate this low, is The Warning. A lot of people love this album, probably think it's maybe their second best album. To me, this is still Queensryche in their Iron Maiden mode. The progressive part of it is just starting to creep in their songs. But it does have my favorite Queensryche song of all time, Take Hold of the Flame, on here. And many others, which are just... This album, top to bottom, is very good. And what holds it down, I think, is sort of the production. It's kind of flat sounding. I think these songs on this album sound much better in concert. If you ever see a live video they put out of this tour of a concert in Japan, it just kills. And I think all the songs sound better on there, so... That's one of the reasons I'm rating it below some of the others. But overall, this is classic top to bottom. Next up, number 4 is the original EP, which originally had 4 songs. Queen of the Reich, Knight Rider, Blinded, Lady Wore Black. And mine has the inclusion of The Prophecy, which is a song that dates back to the beginning of the band, but was recorded during the Rage for Order sessions. That's why I kind of rank it a little bit higher than Take Hold of the Flame. The Warning, because The Prophecy is one of my favorite Queensryche songs. This album just kills. To think that this was recorded in 1982 is unbelievable, really. Queen of the Reich, just blistering metal. And the other classic on here is Lady Wore Back. But the other 2 songs, Knight Rider and Blinded, are also pretty good. I'm pretty sure I had heard Queen of the Reich must have been around the mid-80s. The first time I heard Queensryche was Rage for Order era. So at that point I really started to like them. But I'm sure at some point I had heard Queen of the Reich somewhere, either on MTV or on the radio. Next up, and this might be another surprise to some people, that I'm rating Operation Mindcrime number 3. This album is one of the best, not only hard rock operas, concept albums of all time, but one of the best. And the thing about it is, it actually has a kind of coherent story. You know, a lot of rock operas and concept albums don't really have that much of a coherent story, but this one is really clear. It's a great story, takes place in the future, sort of a totalitarian state, and sort of has that Big Brother element to it also. But again, most of these songs stand alone on their own are awesome. They had a lot of hits from this. Eyes of a Stranger, I Don't Believe in Love, Breaking the Silence, Revolution Calling. But The one thing to me that holds this album back, and I know it was done on purpose, is the production. It has a very metallic, almost like the band recorded inside of a big aluminum garbage can. A lot of reverb, a lot of shotgun drum sounds. But again, it's a product of the times, and it's also recorded that way on purpose. I guess it was supposed to sound futuristic at the time. But the guitars are great. Vocals are great. I mean, this is sort of Queensryche at their peak as far as songwriting. Not the proggiest album, but, you know, definitely their most metallic. This is the one that got them into the mainstream metal scene. Before that, they were sort of a niche band. You sort of had to appreciate that type of music to be into them. So number 2 is Empire. Again, this album top to bottom is unbelievable. The production of this album is awesome. It sounds great. The guitars are great. The vocals are great. Even though this was released in 1990, they were still able to squeeze in a lot of prog elements into this album. And this is the album where they got that Pink Floyd influence, I think, down into their music. And I think that was carried over into The Promised Land as well. I don't think I mentioned that on there. So, you know, previously they sort of incorporated like Rush, maybe a little bit of Yes. But this is the album they sort of incorporate a little Pink Floyd, a little mellow side to them. And that's on Silent Lucidity, obviously. But even some of the other songs have that. And they actually incorporate a lot of cool keyboard sounds on here. Not the normal like Bon Jovi keyboard sounds, but more progressive metal type. Again, this was a huge album, huge MTV hits. I first heard Empire on MTV, ran out and got this album. Saw them on this tour. And it's funny because they never headlined before this tour. So they headlined and played the whole Operation Mindcrime album, along with a lot of songs from this album. And the thing about Queensryche that they were able to do that a band like Rush never did was they had a lot of female fans, which is surprising because even before Silent Lucidity, like even the Rage for Order era, they had a lot of female fans, which somehow they were able to do. Rush was never able to do that, but they were. But again, this is my, my 1 and 2, I can interchange at any time, I think. My number 1, I think, is the album that when someone says, what is Queensryche, and you just give them Rage for Order. This album is so ahead of its time in many ways, considering it came out in 1986. It's heavy, it's progressive, it definitely has a touch of the Pink Floyd elements on this album. When you listen to this, it's almost a concept album, but it doesn't really have a storyline. But it's such a great album top to bottom. I think Queensryche is a band that some of their songs can be, even if you're not a fan of the band, you can like them. But if you're a fan of the band, this is the Queensryche you like. Like I said, great, brilliant album. So I just wanted to point out, too, that Queensryche were one of those bands around the time of Empire started issuing a lot of B-sides on their CD singles. And a lot of them were really good, including a song called The Real World, which was on a soundtrack, Last Action Hero, I think, which is a horrible Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. So they're one of those bands that definitely worth it seeking out the singles for. Along with their compilations, they have a couple of good compilation albums. And they have a lot of those CD single B-sides on here. This one actually had a couple new Chris DeGarmo songs, Justified, I believe, and Chasing Blue Sky, that weren't on any albums. Which reminds me, I forgot to include another album I didn't have called Tribe. That album came out before, I believe, Operation Mindcrime 2. And it is a pretty good album. I don't have it for whatever reason. I thought I did, but I must have never picked it up. Chris DeGarmo came back to write 4 songs on there, and those songs are really good. But the rest of their album is pretty good too. it's sort of an anomaly in the catalog because it's getting back to that progressive element a little bit. But overall, it's not a great album, but it's worth picking up for the 4 DeGarmo songs. I would probably rate it in between Take Cover and Here in the Now Frontier. So, I can't believe I forgot that. Anyway, they also have a pretty good live album called Live Evolution. This was after the Q2K tour. And they played a huge long set, which I think was some sort of anniversary. The only problem I have with this album is Kelly Gray is the guitar player at the time, and I mentioned his solos aren't really... He covers the Chris DeGarmo solos, and they aren't really that great. I wish Michael Wilton had taken those over as well at this point, like he does now. But overall, this is a good compilation. Not a compilation, good concert, and has a lot of the early songs on here. And some songs you don't expect to hear live, like Hit the Black, Right Side of My Mind. So, definitely worth picking up. And of course, there's the famous Operation Live Crime live version of Operation Mindcrime, which came out in the early 90s. This is from the Empire Tour. The album just has Operation Mindcrime Live. And at the time, I got the VHS version. They put it out later on a double CD DVD issue. I like keeping this because it's got this huge book, you know. But they put it out, I think, on DVD as well by itself. But, you know, the album alone is worth keeping just for that. Anyway, thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you like these videos. I should have some more videos coming up in the next day or two. So thanks a lot. Let me know your comments on Queensryche.